We're singing a turkey song today. Don't be a turkey, just give thanks. It's the classic, word of life song tonight.
I would not like it when people call it Turkey Day.
Right. You're on.
All right. Welcome to Medieval Times. I think we have tonight, and we are not going to be here next week. And then I think we have two more before Christmas break. So we'll be very close to ending Medieval Times. Unless we'll go into the Renaissance next, and that's sort of part of Medieval Times. So I haven't looked that far ahead to know whether I'll include that as part of Medieval Times. We might, sort of a transitional period. But tonight we're going to be looking at language and literature. I hope that you are among the people that I've talked to who regret not reading more in high school and college, and wish they had read maybe even more carefully. I know some of the things I read in college I didn't pay a lot of attention to. I wish I had been more diligent and gone back and read some things. And we're going to be talking about a couple of works of literature that most people know about, but very few people have probably read. So let's begin there. Let's ask God's blessing on our time. Father, as we look into these people that lived so long ago and really spoke a different language, even if it was English, it's certainly is different than what we speak today. And even though they may have had some erroneous ideas, there are many ways they can challenge us in our Christian living, and were themselves devoted to you, even if imperfectly. So we thank you for these people that we've been studying throughout our looking at medieval times, and then before that, we see over and over again people that are dedicated to you and are striving as best they can to communicate what that means. And we've seen people that are seemingly dedicated against you, and we take lessons from that as well. So we ask for your guidance tonight as we look at these different works of literature, and help us to glean from it those things that you think are important. And may you be glorified through your creation and the creativeness of your creation. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're looking at language and literature as we are coming to the end of medieval times. And we've been looking at the 13th century, a very pivotal century. A lot of things happened in the 13th century. If you look back over your notes for the past probably couple of months, we've been looking at things that happened in the 13th century. Not always in chronological order, because I'm thinking, for example, the Black Plague. Although it's centered around a particular number of years, it wasn't only then. It came and went over in different times during the 13th century. So if you look at the 13th century, and we kind of have to look at categories there. And this is one of the categories, language and literature. So as we consider that, understand that the common language of Europe, and that's where we're looking primarily, is Europe, and especially Western Europe, was it's good for us to understand the Latin was the language of the learned. And that had some advantages and disadvantages. So what would you think? And then see the next part, the common tongue or language varied from region to region. So what would be, either give me advantage or disadvantage, whichever one you think of, to Latin being the language of the learned and yet not the language of the common people? So people who are literate and educated all spoke and wrote Latin. Common people who are not educated did not. So what advantages or disadvantages would there be?
It would be like the medical field today, you know, Latin. Because the terminology is all in Latin. It gives you a consistency I was gonna say meaning, but that's the wrong way of definition,
Of expression.
expression. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, explain why that's an advantage.
Well, your tibius is a tibius. You know, that tibius is here, and it's only known as tibius.
No
You know
matter,
it's a tibius, I know it's a tibius, he knows it. You know, everybody has a, you know, A equals A equals A equals A. You know, I might call it a bone in my leg. But a doctor will call it my tibius.
and that is true no matter where you go in the world. Right? You know, no matter where a person goes to medical school, they're going to learn those same terms for different parts of the body, or if you're studying plants. Because even to this day, all those important terms are Latin terms. That's why it's very helpful to learn Latin. Because no matter what field you're in, well, maybe not no matter what field, but in many fields, it becomes useful. And even in the field that we all deal with, and that is the English language, because so much of it comes from Latin, as well as other languages.
I'm pretty famous in Latin.
Are you?
Yeah, because I had Latin in high school, and there was no word for picnic. So I named it Picasnicus. That's
And that is in the Latin dictionary today.
yeah, I'm part of history.
Probably not. So the advantage is that no matter whether you're French, German, English, Italian, that when you are looking at scholarly material, it's in Latin, and everybody in whatever country you're in can read it. You don't have to translate any particular work that someone does into the language of a different country, because everybody who is educated understands Latin. So even if you're going to school, we talked before about the establishment of universities. And remember, there's a couple of the more famous ones was at Paris, another one at Bologna. Now, in what language do people around Paris speak? French. What language do people around Bologna speak? Italian. And yet, if you were a student and went to either of those universities, you didn't have to worry about translating anything because they're speaking in Latin and you understand Latin. See what a big advantage that would be? You don't look convinced. Now, English has kind of become that way today. Because if you want to be involved in commerce, a business, English is the language of trade. So anywhere you go in the world, if you're involved in the business world, you're probably going to be encountering people who understand English, except Japan.
No, it's so bad that it was 20 years ago, 15 years ago in France, because of technology, we do bits, bytes, computers, you know, mouses, and that's the way it translates over. There were more English words because of the tech industry, and they had to stop that and say, look, we got to name our stuff.
Because the French in their arrogance don't like English words.
Right, sure.
In fact, at one point they were, I think they were passing a law against speaking English or something in English language because it wasn't all be in French.
Tech industry, yeah.
All right, so
And then Jesus' day, of course, Greek.
yeah,
Was similar way.
everybody spoke Greek
Mhm.
and could read Greek. Even though the common language in the area where Jesus and the disciples, all those people lived, was Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew. So they all spoke Aramaic, they all spoke Greek, and many of them also spoke Latin because of the Roman influence. And you know, we think today in our country, You know, most of us are happy if we just learn English. And yet, uneducated people in Jesus' time could speak and understand probably 3 languages, if not more. And that's true throughout the world. I remember when my wife Beth went to South Africa, she visited a classroom of 2nd graders, and they were from a tribe that spoke Xhosa, which is a language that had clicks in it and stuff like that. They also, because one of the major languages of South Africa is Afrikaans, which is a form of Dutch, but English is the official language, and so they also learned Afrikaans and English. And when she told them that she only understood and spoke English, she said they looked at her like, "What are you, stupid or something?" Because here 2nd graders, they had, you know, most of 3 languages under their belt, and throughout most of the world it's that way. But so anyway, that helps us maybe understand a little bit about what was going on in Europe. Latin is the language of education, culture, all of that. But there were common languages that had developed, like French and German and Italian, Spanish, English, and sometimes those things overlap one another, especially English, which includes words from all the other languages, it seems, or is influenced by them. All right, now, what happened in the 12th century, and especially then going into the 13th century, is that writers began to use the common spoken language, or vernacular, it's called, in literature. They started writing things for people who would read it in their own language, and not just in Latin. This is going to be big, because that means that what you're writing is intended for whom?
Regular people,
Yeah,
common people.
yeah, the common people. Here. Pardon?
Oh, literacy, were they able to read?
Well, remember, as we were moving out of the Middle Ages into the late Middle Ages, and the results of the Crusades and all that, with and the advent of Greek literature coming into Western Europe, there was a greater interest in literature and getting back to basics, getting back to the Greek, especially, getting to other things than the Bible, but also understanding the Bible in original languages. So education exploded, and so you had the universities, and so coupled with that is the economic development that you had as a result of the trade, which took place because of Europeans becoming exposed to goods from Asia because of the Crusades and other things that brought all that. And so as you're moving away from the feudal manners, remember that as more and more people are moving off of the manners and using their specialized skills to develop a trade that they can use to make money, and you have the development of the middle class, because the demise of the barter system, you have coinage, and so all those things and more contribute to the development of a middle class. And as you have a middle class, you have people who are earning more than a living. You know, when you're just scratching dirt every day trying to raise enough food for your family to eat, you not only don't have any interest in education, you don't have time. But as the middle class develops and people began to make more than they need to live on, education becomes more important. And so middle class fathers want their children to be educated and to at least appear as good as the nobility who is educated. So education begins to flourish, which means more and more people are becoming literate, and even down to the lowest people, because they're no longer a serf or a slave on a manor. Now they're, even if they're a common laborer, They have aspirations for doing better than that. So literacy goes up. That's a long answer to your question, but that's why all the things that we've talked about for months come together, and they all have an influence on what develops. And even though we've looked at things separately, they're all influencing together what is occurring here, so that when I say that writers begin to use the common spoken language in literature, there's a whole lot of background behind how we get to that point. You see? And there may have been times when you've wondered, why is he giving us information about this? I don't really care about that. But it's because it relates to other things. And that's the way history is, which is one of the things that makes it so fascinating, because you're always looking at cause and effect. You know, you look at any particular thing and you say, what was the cause of that? And then you go back and you see, well, it was this. Well, what caused that? So you can go backwards that way, or you can start at the beginning as we did, and we're seeing causes all along the way that lead to other things in conjunction with one another, and the complicated web of cause and effects that lead to a number of things. And this is simply one of them. Isn't that fascinating? I'm glad you think so. So and people who are writing see the opportunity for their ideas to get out to a broader range of people. If I put this into vernacular, it's not just intended for the upper echelon, it's intended for people in general, and including upper echelon, because yeah, they can read Latin, but they also can read their own language. And so you get a lot more people reading in the vernacular. Okay. So we begin to have literature for the people. Popular were the heroic epics, long and narrative poems that celebrated the adventures of legendary heroes, such as Beowulf. Did you ever read Beowulf when you're in college, maybe, or sometime? How many remember reading Beowulf? How many understood it? I recommend to you a book that I recommended a long time ago in relationship to the things that occurred after the flood. A book that's called appropriately After the Flood by Bill Cooper. And he does a lot of things in that book. Mostly he shows how European royalty traced their lineage back to Japheth, son of Noah. It's in their records. Not something that secular humanists are going to tell you, but it's in the records of the royalties of the royal families of Europe. But one of the things he also deals with, shows a lot of evidences over, especially in the Middle Ages, of the presence of dinosaurs, pterodactyls, things like that during the Middle Ages. People recorded sightings, even drew pictures sometimes. But there's so much in that book. I'm surprised it's only that thick. He also goes through the epic poem of Beowulf and interprets it. I don't remember. I don't want to get into details. I don't remember enough of it to be able to tell you exactly, but I found it to be very interesting, because it's not the interpretation that I got from whoever taught it to me in high school or college. It has a biblical basis to what's going on there, as well as, I think, the presence of a dinosaur. Song of Roland. Did you ever read that? I remember reading that in college. And it's about a guy who, I'm trying to remember now. He turns out to be a traitor. I think this is during the battles between Muslims and Europeans. Anyway, the Song of Nibelungs, and I don't know anything about that. El Cid, that's a narrative drama about a guy in Spain, a knight in Spain. So these are the kind of things that were attractive. You know, these long narrative poems that you could read on a winter's night in front of the fire, and they were exciting, they were adventures. So that's what people were wanting. There were also wandering minstrels called troubadours, who popularized the vernacular in lyric poetry, traveling from castle to castle, singing their songs of love and adventure to noblemen and their ladies. The best known medieval romance was the tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Sir Lancelot, Guinevere, all those. So people are being exposed more and more to literature. Now we want to look at a couple of people, a couple of men who wrote literature that have been influential not only in their time, but to the present day. And the first one is Dante Alighieri. Dante is usually how he's known. He was an Italian poet, and he's called the father of modern Italian because he was the first one to write an important work in that language rather than in the more formal Latin. His most famous work is a long poem called Divine Comedy. It's not funny. That's not why it's called that. But in this, Dante takes an imaginary journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, reflecting the religious beliefs, social order, and political turbulence of the late Middle Ages. One of his guides is the Roman poet Virgil. Now here is a painting of Dante's work, and behind him, I hope you can see that mount. That is the multi-tiered Mount Purgatory. An angel guards the gate. You see there? The angel, see the wings? That's the gate in the purgatory. And there are 3 steps there. You see, can you see the steps from where you are? There's a white marble step, which stands for confession. A cracked black stone, which stands for contrition. And red porphyry for Christ's blood sacrifice. With his sword, the angel marks each penitent's forehead with seven P's. Why P? Because of the Latin word for sin, which is peccatum, or the 7 deadly sins. When these wounds are washed away by penance, the soul may enter earthly paradise at the mountain's summit. So you're entering into purgatory, and you're climbing up. Finally, when you get up to the summit, that's paradise. In the 3rd section of the Divine Comedy, called Paradiso, Dante visits the planets and constellations where blessed souls dwell. And he goes into a lot of detail about planets and constellations and all that. But one of the things that it's difficult to figure out is that he makes reference to the constellation, the Southern Cross. Now, do you know anything about that constellation, the Southern Cross? Does anybody know where it's visible? The name of it might give you a clue.
Yes.
Southern Hemisphere. Where did Dante live? In what hemisphere did Dante live? The Northern Hemisphere or the Southern Hemisphere? Need to get a world map out here.
That's right.
He was north of the equator.
north of the equator, which makes it.
There's a ball up there.
We refer to that as divine intervention.
This, what is this line called?
The equator.
The equator, all right. Sorry for being so basic, but I know it's been a long time since you've talked about this stuff or read it. Okay. Which hemisphere is below the equator?
Southern.
The southern hemisphere. Which hemisphere is above the equator? Northern hemisphere. In what country does Dante live? He's the father of Italian,
Italy.
so that makes it Italy. Italy is there. So in what hemisphere is Italy?
Northern.
The northern hemisphere. Could Dante see the Southern Cross, which is visible in the southern hemisphere? No. In fact, I guess there have been times when it's visible. But the last time that the Southern Cross had been visible in Italy was 3000 BC. And yet he writes about it. And there are no extant written records describing it, but he does. And I don't know if anybody knows how he knew about that. Maybe I should keep this handy.
So on your list, if any of us ever saw it, did you say that?
No, but have you?
No.
Let's see, I have not been in the southern hemisphere. Any of you been in the southern hemisphere? Where
Brazil.
Brazil? Nobody pointed the Southern Cross out to you? It's like, you know, around here we say, oh, there's the Big Dipper, there's the North Star. You know, for the southern hemisphere, it's the Southern Cross. Okay. All right, so just an interesting side note about Dante's work. The gate to Dante's Hell, which is over there on the left side of the painting, bore the dire message, which I think you've heard: abandon hope, all who enter here. You ever heard that? Did you know it was the gates of hell? No. Condemned sinners didn't actually walk into hell, but were ferried there by Charon, whom Dante borrowed from classical mythology. Just like his borrowing Virgil from Rome, he borrowed other things from mythology. They were then sentenced by Minos, M-I-N-O-S, another classical figure, to their appropriate punishments. The very bottom of hell was not fiery, as this image seems to suggest. So down here is not fire, it's actually ice. And I didn't have time to reproduce the picture of Satan that comes from Dante's Divine Comedy, or sometimes Dante's Inferno, which shows Satan encased in ice. The city on the right, you see that city? Takes up quite a bit of space. That is actually Dante's hometown of Florence, from which he was banned in 1302 upon penalty of incineration should he ever return. However, all was forgiven apparently when he died, because the city that had his body was prevailed upon by Florence to send his body back home. And I think if I remember right, they sent them an empty casket. So they didn't get it.
Bill, is Dante's Inferno a part of Divine
Yes.
Comedy? And that's the walk through hell.
Yes.
Are there other names of other books for purgatory and
Well,
paradise?
I think no. The one part is purgatory. Paradise.
Paradise,
So
yeah, it's the third.
there's purgatory, paradise, and inferno. I believe that's correct. The purpose, Dante in a letter gave us the purpose of this work. He said it's to remove those living in this life from the state of misery and to lead them to the state of bliss. So, in other words, what was he saying? Why did he write this? What was his purpose in writing this? Largely imaginative piece on purgatory and inferno and paradise. I'll read it again. The purpose of the comedy is to remove those living in this life from the state of misery and to lead them to the state of bliss. What's he trying to do? To remove those living in this life from the state of misery. What would be the state of misery? Hell. And even purgatory. And to lead them to the state of bliss, which is paradise. So why is he writing this? To save people, basically to save people.
Right.
He wants them to commit themselves to God, to do those things that are necessary so they don't go to inferno, they don't go to hell. So he has all good reasons behind what he's doing. In the process, he does communicate things that, of course, are not really true, but that's he has a good goal. Let me share with you his bedrock beliefs. Among the basic convictions that shape the storyline of Dante's great poem are these. First, people are responsible to God, whether they know it or not. You would agree with that, right? Next, the human race was created by a loving God whose purpose was for people to choose righteously through life in order to see and be with God. What did the Westminster Confession of Faith say about that? It says something similar. The first question in the Catechism, the Westminster Catechism, did any of you ever learn that? The chief end of man. We should learn some good old Presbyterian catechism around this Baptist church.
Glorify God and enjoy him forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what Dante's saying. That's our purpose, is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I'll read it again. He said, human race was created by a loving God whose purpose was for people to choose righteously through life in order to see and be with God. Next point, because people possess free will, their choices between good and evil shape their experience of life for time and eternity. And because decisions are shaped by desires, people must learn to desire God and his will. So what's he saying? That your choices determine what happens to you, not only in this life, but in the life to come. And so his desire is that people learn to desire God and his will instead of desiring their own fleshly things. So he's right on there. I mean, we might quibble with because people do possess free will. It depends what you mean by that. They don't possess free will to the point where they are able to do good and to choose God, but everyone has free will within the limitations of their constituted nature. Everyone makes choices according to their own desires, and that is the expression of will. He also said, right understanding leads to right conduct. I think I've seen posters that say things similar to that. While wrong choices frustrate God's intentions and justly lead to negative consequences. If you choose right, if you do right, then you'll act right. If you make wrong choices, you're going to have negative consequences. I mean, there's not a parent here who hasn't communicated that to their children. Right? He says, unforgiven sin diminishes sinners, depriving them of their very humanity. Think about that for a moment. A person who's living in sin, unforgiven sin, diminishes them. It makes them less. It has a negative effect on them. Deprives them of their very humanity. I mean, we talk about in history people who are extremely evil, and we say that they didn't have any humanity. But he said Christian virtues enable people to develop into the full stature God intended them to have. And I think you could say that even for a person who's not a believer, if they're living by Christian virtues, they're not going to have everything that God intended for mankind to have, but they're certainly going to have a better life than if they were not living by those Christian virtues. So I have heard of people who don't believe the Bible, but follow the teachings because they know it leads to a better life for themselves, just selfishly. So those are some of the bedrock beliefs of Dante. So the Divine Comedy presents a vision of the love of God evident in his government of the universe and in his grace expressed to humankind. The poem explores the central issues affecting the meaning and purpose of life and culminates in consuming praise for the wisdom of God's ways. So it's thoroughly Christian, certainly, even though it has a lot of stuff in it that's not necessarily biblical, but the ideas behind it have good intentions, certainly. Let's see what else. Skipping over some things that may not be as interesting or relevant. Dante did emphasize free will and human responsibility to the point where he says that the inhabitants of hell may not blame Satan for their bad choices. They can only look to themselves because his power over them is severely limited. Now, one of the questions we might have is, purgatory seems to have a central place here. But remember, that's a part of the church's teaching that at this point, not too many, if any, are questioning. It's what the church teaches. And so climbing Mount Purgatory is a part of Dante's journey where he's learning to desire God and his good above all else, and to see all things in relation to him and to act accordingly. What made me think of is Pilgrim's Progress. How many of you read Pilgrim's Progress? Okay. And the rest of you kind of know the story. A pilgrim is on a journey, and he's progressing, from where he lives, and as he goes along, he encounters different things. But all those different people with whom he comes in contact, all those different things with which he has to deal are designed to shape him until eventually he comes to the point where his burden is taken away as he trusts fully in Christ. And I think Dante sees Mount Purgatory as that same kind of a thing. It's the journey that enables you to learn to seek after God.
It's now.
He says the process of becoming holy is initiated by conversion. And that goes back to those 3 steps the confession, contrition, and blood satisfaction. And then at the top, Dante enters the earthly paradise, and he's been restored to the condition of unfallen man. Okay, I think that's all I'll say about Dante's work. There's a lot more, and a lot of what I have learned about it comes from an edition of Christian History magazine, which was dedicated to Dante. So if you're interested in reading more, grab that. You can borrow that or get a hold of Dante's Inferno or listen to it. I think I listened to it a few years ago. You can get it on at what's the name of that? It's a place where people read books. No, not audiobooks. You have to pay for that. It's one you don't have to pay for, which also means that the reading is not as good.
Marcia said the library.
The library. LibriVox is the name of it. LibriVox. If you go there, you find all kinds of literature.
What was that again?
LibriVox, LibriVox, LibriVox.
Isn't that like public domain books?
Yeah, yeah. And some of them are very well done. Others sound like they're being read by English as a second language students. But yeah, sometimes they're good. So you can listen to Dante's Inferno. I listened to Summa Theologica by Aquinas through them. I've listened to Sherlock Holmes, all kinds of different books. Listen to Dickens. All right, any questions about Dante and his Divine Comedy? So now you know more about the Divine Comedy than 95% of the people in the English-speaking world.
Did you mention that it's an allegory?
I didn't, but it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like John Milton's Paradise
Yeah.
Lost and Hind's Feet in High Places, a more contemporary.
And Milton is a couple centuries later. And that was very attractive to people at that time. It caused them to think and to visualize things.
The thing I remember is it was such an important work in that era because it really solidified Tuscan language. And why I would remember that after all these years, I have no idea. But it was one of
Tell them about what Tuscan is.
Tuscany is a section of Italy and
Southern Italy.
Southern Italy, well, maybe
Isn't
that's
it?
what Southern Cross was so important. No,
No, it's not
Tuscany
southern.
is-
It's northern,
northwest, isn't it?
must
Below
be northeast. But
It's a
maybe-
village in Poland, it's a little town in Poland or a little.
Right down the road here to the right. That's good.
Anyway,
Yeah, it's over and it's, but no, it was just a very important part of the development
and it becomes part of the language of the people.
of today's Italian language, basically.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I didn't mention, but will become clear probably as we go along, is each of these works done in the vernacular language help to kind of create the language, because there's a lot of differences between different towns, whatever, the vocabulary, how they pronounce things, and these works help to bring a commonality to even their vernacular language.
This was before Italy was Italy.
Right.
I guess is what we're struggling with, is
Yeah.
Italy was a bunch of things, and I forget what year.
It wasn't until the 1800s that Italy
Somebody
became
brought it
united.
together and made it into a country
Yeah,
of Italy, yeah. Because you still have one little
Garibaldi.
spot about that big in the middle of Italy that still is it's not part of the country. It's
Yeah.
its own, what would you call it, city state.
Yeah. It's a sovereign nation, Vatican.
Oh, no, there's another little one. down
Oh, another one?
Right above, yeah, it's just a little spot.
Not Monaco.
No, I couldn't tell you the name if I can't remember the name, I'm too old.
Tiger Town.
Punxsutawney, that's it.
I didn't realize the Southern Cross is on a bunch of flags, New Zealand, Australia.
Yeah, I forgot about
Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
I looked up the Southern Cross. I looked it on Sky Guide to find it. It's down there. Actually.
You want- You need this?
Nah.
It's on the cover. of
That's because in-
Crosby,
in-
Stills, Nash and Young's album, also the Southern Cross.
Yeah.
That's right. I was wrong.
That's right.
That's right.
Because in Australia, and New Zealand, all those places, there wasn't much else to do except look up at the sky at night. Oh, there's the Southern Cross, let's put it on our flag.
Not a lot of light pollution either, so they can see
Yeah,
the stars.
You
pretty
can
well.
see it, yeah. All right. Any other comments, questions? See, we're learning so much tonight. Okay, let's go to another guy that I'm sure you've heard of. Geoffrey Chaucer. See his years. He's a prominent English poet using the vernacular language, the English of his time, which we will probably not be able to understand. So if you get a translation of his works, I mean, it will be a translation into English from English, but a different kind of English. The Canterbury Tales is his most famous work, and one which, and anybody read the Canterbury Tales? I think maybe I read it in college, I'm not sure, didn't really understand too much of what was going on. Like most things. I remember I had a world literature class, which if we read it would have been in there. But it met at 7:30 in the morning up in the attic, I think, of the old administration building. You know where that is, Brian? He had to climb these wooden stairs to get up the top. And at 7:30 in the morning, there should have been all kinds of classrooms available. Why they put us up there so that in the wintertime, all the heat is rising. And at that hour of the morning, none of us are real awake anyway. And, reading these old pieces of literature. Anyway, so most of us, if we did read them, probably don't remember a lot about them. So the Canterbury Tales. It's a collection of stories told in verse. Well, let me just address this because we've mentioned a number of times now that a lot of these works are poetry. What's the advantage of that?
Cadence.
Which means that
It's easily to be remembered.
Yeah.
It has a beat.
Yeah.
And you can memorize it very simply. Remember, the printing press hasn't been invented yet.
right. Good point. So even if you're educated and can read, you don't necessarily have the money to buy a copy because somebody has to handwrite it. So if somebody has a copy, they read it, and if your family has a copy or whatever, you read it over and over again, because there's almost no limit to the depths that you can mine out of these works because they're allegory.
A good example of cadence is the King James Bible. If you want to memorize, the easiest version of any Bible to memorize is the King James, because it has a rhythm to it.
Yeah, it kind of follows the same way of speaking, writing. If they had just put the poetry in poetic fashion, but they didn't because of space. You don't want to take up a lot of space because that means you're using more paper. So when the authorized version was printed, they didn't put things in stanzas like our modern translations do. So anyway, the Canterbury Tales is a collection of stories in verse told by pilgrims on their way to visit the tomb of Thomas à Becket at Canterbury. Remember Thomas à Becket? Please say you remember at least the name Thomas à Becket. So they're on their way, they're on a pilgrimage. And as they're going along to pass the time, they tell stories. They don't have a phone to look at, and so they actually communicate with one another. And these are the stories, but they're not just stories. They're very interesting tales that tell us a lot about the people at the time that Chaucer wrote, and sometimes with some veiled criticism of the people. So let's watch this first, and then I'll tell you about individual people.
A portly miller, barely sober enough to sit on his horse, rambles on about the flighty wife of a crotchety old carpenter and the scholar she takes as her lover. To get some time alone together, the scholar and the wife play various tricks that involve feigning madness, staging a biblical flood, and exposing themselves in public. The parish clerk is also busted out with wife, comes by every night to sing outside her house. This becomes so tiresome that she tries to scare him away by hanging her rear end out of the window for him to kiss. When this appears not to work, her scholar decides to try farting in the same position. And this time, the clerk is waiting with a red-hot poker. This might all sound like a bawdy joke. This part of one of the most esteemed works of English literature ever created, the Canterbury Tales, which seamlessly blends the lofty and the lowly. The work consists of 24 stories, each told by one of Chaucer's spirited characters. The ratings include familiar medieval figures such as a knight, clerk, and a nun, and the less recognizable Breed and Manson, and others. The tales written in Middle English, which often looks entirely different from the language spoken today. It was used between the 12th and 15th centuries and evolved from Old English due to increased contact with European Romantic languages after the Norman conquest of 1066. Most of the Middle English alphabet is still familiar today, with the inclusion of a few archaic symbols such as Y, which denotes the Y, J, or G sound. The loquacious cast of the tales first meet at the Tabard Inn in Southwark. They have a journey in common, pilgrimage to Canterbury, visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, a martyred archbishop who was murdered in his own cathedral. Eager and nosy for some personal details, the host of the inn proposes a competition. Whoever tells the best tale will be treated to dinner. If not for their pilgrimage, many of these figures would never have had the chance to interact. This is because medieval society followed a feudal system that divided the clergy and nobility from the working classes, made up of peasants and serfs. By Chaucer's time, the professional class, merchants, and intellectuals would also emerge. Chaucer spent most of his life as a government official during the 100 Years' War, traveling throughout Italy and France, as well as his native England. This may have influenced the panoramic vision of his work, and in the tales, no level of society is above mockery. Chaucer uses the quirks of the character's language, the ribald humor of his cook, the solemn prose of the parson, and the lofty notions of the squire are satirized and well used. The varied dialects, genres, and literary tropes also make the work a vivid record of the different ways medieval audiences entertain themselves. For instance, The Knight's Tale, courtly love, chivalry, and destiny riffs on romance, while the tales of working class narrating are generally comedies filled with scatological language, sexual deviance, and slapsticks. This variation includes something for everyone, and that's one reason why readers continue to delight in the work in both Middle English and translation. While the narrative runs to over 17,000 lines, it's apparently unfinished, as the prologue ambitiously introduces 29 pilgrims and promises 4 stories apiece, and the innkeeper never crowned a victor.
You met 17,000 lines. That's a long poem. And apparently what he's saying here is it wasn't ever finished.
It's possible that Chaucer was so caught up in his sumptuous ravings that he delayed picking a winner, and perhaps he was so fond of his character that he just couldn't choose. Whatever the reason, this means that every reader is free to judge. The question of who wins is up to you. Do you love literature? Are you looking for recommendations on what to read next? Check out ed.ted.com/books for a full list of TED Ed book recs. Happy reading.
All right, let me go through some of the characters, tell you a little bit about them. Among the travelers was the wife of Bath. Bath is the name of a place. Who outlived 5 husbands, marrying first at age 12. She awaits number 6 whenever he appears. Meanwhile, she carries on a vigorous crusade against the church's attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, and women. She also thinks that the church's perspective on virginity is unwarranted. Acknowledging that St. Paul counseled virginity, she states, quote, "But counseling is no commandment," unquote. She argues that if everyone were to follow this advice, we would run out of virgins. So that's the wife of Bath. What does she sound like today?
Feminist.
Yeah, feminist. That's what I thought of. Another pilgrim was the prioress. That's Prioress. Characterized as a sentimental savage. She was head of a women's monastery who seemed to be more concerned with worldly things than spiritual. Chaucer says that she took pains to imitate the behavior of the court and to be dignified of manner. Her hypocrisy is revealed in that she grieves over the suffering of a mouse or dog, but the tale that she approvingly tells is of the hanging and disemboweling of Jews accused of murdering a young Christian boy. A third character was the parson, quote unquote, a Puritan ahead of his time. Unlike those who saw church work as the means to a career, and there were many like that, this poor parson never left his sheep encumbered in the mire to run to London after advancement, but dwelt at home and kept well his fold. So at this point, sounds like he is a pretty big guy. He believes that it is his duty to set an example to his flock, helping the poorest out of church and personal funds, visiting the sick while endangering his own health, and being gentle to sinners while rebuking the unmoved. The Parson's Tale is a traditional Catholic treatise on examining one's conscience before confession. Written in plain prose, an elaborate structure, and a blizzard of biblical quotations, the treatise analyzes the 7 deadly sins, defining each and giving counsel how to fight them. The Parson's Tale, the final of the 24 stories in the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, may have been intended with this plethora of pious quotations as a fitting close to the stories of the religious pilgrims. So even though I haven't dealt with it's the last one. After you hear all the debauchery and the awful things that characterize all the other people, you finally get to the parson, and it's like taking a shower or something, or finally something good. After reviewing the sins of pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lechery, and the remedies, the parson urges confession and satisfaction, that is, atonement, through such acts as almsgiving, penance, and fasting. It is thought that the model for the parson may have been John Wycliffe, whom we'll get to. Probably not in this section. I'm going to hold off and talk about him out of chronological order, but in relationship to ideas, because he is a forerunner of the Reformation. All right, so here's a section of the parson. You might be able to read that if you're close enough. There was a good man of religion, too, a country parson, poor, I warrant you, but rich he was in holy thought and work. He was a learned man also, a clerk, who Christ's own gospel truly sought to preach. Devoutly his parishioners would he teach. Benign he was, and wondrous diligent, patient in adverse times, and well content. As he was oft times proven, always blithe, he was right loath to curse to get a tithe. But rather would he give, in case of doubt, unto those poor parishioners about part of his income, even of his goods. Enough with little colored all his moods. Wide was his parish, houses far asunder, but never did he fail for rain or thunder. In sickness or in sin or any state, to visit to the farthest, small and great. Going afoot and in his hand a stave. This fine example to his flock he gave. That first he wrought and afterwards he taught. Out of the gospel then, that text he caught, and this figure he added thereunto, that if gold rust, what shall poor iron do? For if the priest be foul, in whom we trust, what wonder if a layman yield to lust? And shame it is if priests take thought for keep, a shitty shepherd shepherding clean sheep. Well, ought a priest example good to give, by his own cleanness how his flock should live. He never let his benefice for hire, leaving his flock to flounder in the mire, and ran to London up to old St. Paul's to get himself a chantry there for souls. Nor in some brotherhood did he withhold, but dwelt at home and kept so well the fold that never wolf could make his plans miscarry. He was a shepherd and not mercenary, and holy though he was and virtuous, to sinners he was not impietous, nor haughty in his speech, nor too divine, but in all teaching prudent and benign. To lead folk into heaven, but by stress of good example was his busyness. But if some sinful one proved obstinate, be who it might of high or low estate, him he reproved, and sharply as I know. There is nowhere a better priest, I trow. He had no thirst for pomp or reverence, nor made himself a special spiced conscience, but Christ's own lore and his apostles 12 he taught, but first he followed it himself. So this is a man that apparently Chaucer respected, the only one among those that were on the traveling, among the traveling companions. There's another guy called the Pardoner, who appears as an indulgence hawker. Now, if you know anything about the Reformation, you know that in part it started because of the selling of indulgences, which was a way to pay for a document saying that your sins were forgiven or the sins of somebody in purgatory were taken away. It was a way of purchasing forgiveness. Here Chaucer levels his most violent attack on the corruptions of the medieval church. And with these things, we can also see a movement toward what's going to come. The Pardoner seems hell-bent to scam every Christian in England. In his pack, he carries a pillowcase, which he says is Mary's veil. A shred of cloth is part of the very sail St. Peter used before Jesus called him. With these and other relics, he boasts that once he finds a little country town, he can make more money in a day than the local parson will in 2 months. And just let's pause for a moment and consider relics. Relics are supposed to be part of the thing they represent and to channel its power. Medieval theory says a false relic does not have any effect, but no one would admit to having a false relic. They all claim to have a true splinter from the cross, or the true. Some of them claim to have, a drop of Mary's breast milk in a vial. I mean, just all kinds of crazy things. Now, the pilgrims here are traveling to a true relic, the remains of Thomas of Becket, so they know that he really is buried there. But the Pardoner sells phony relics, which have no ability to convey power. His sheep's bones are as worthless as the hog's turd that Harry Bailey mentions at line 499. All right, so that's coming next. Then he displays, furthermore, he loves explaining how he does it. First, he tells his listeners he is from Rome and shows them papal bulls certifying his indulgences. Then he displays other warrants signed by the bishop, that none may be so bold, no priest nor clerk, to interfere with Jesus's holy work. Then he hauls out his relics, especially a sheep's bone that was of that of a holy Jew. Dip the bone in a well, wash the tongue of your cattle with water from the well, and it miraculously cures all worm infestations and snake bites. Even more remarkably, the bone cures jealousy. Boil it in your husband's soup, he tells the ladies, and he'll trust you ever after. Although he knows that for a certainty, you've bedded down a priest or two or three. There will always be some skeptics, of course, but the Pardoner knows how to deal with them. He proclaims up front that some people's sins are so heinous, such folk shall lack the power and the grace to offer to my relics in this place. Who would have the courage to defy an accusation like that? Finally, the partner launches into his sermon. His constant theme, the lover of money, is the root of evil. Of avarice and such cursedness is all my preaching, and it makes them free to give of all they have, namely to me. So Chaucer really takes a bite out of these different people and what they stand for, how they live. So it's really interesting stuff, although it may be difficult for us to understand as we read about them. All right. Any questions or comments about Chaucer? I would suggest if reading Chaucer, probably have some kind of a commentary on him to explain the stuff as he's going along.
How
There's
many
some
travelers are there? or buildings?
24, and these are just a few of the more famous ones. I think it's 24.
I thought you said that, but I looked it up, it said 30,
Oh,
so I don't know. I'll trust you.
I don't know. Well, I'm just getting my information from someplace just like you did, so either source might be incorrect. Any other comments?
I was just looking up relics, I think it was somewhere here in Youngstown, the arm of Saint Thomas,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, was.
Well, every Roman Catholic altar is supposed to have a relic under it and whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that still is true or not. It was true in the Middle Ages. And so there was a great business in selling relics, as this guy does. Because if you want to build a church, you got to have a relic to put in it. And as we'll get to, the church that Martin Luther was associated with, the University of Wittenberg, the guy who was in charge of all that had a lot of relics. He kept buying more and more relics, and people would travel from miles around to come visit these relics because they would get some kind of forgiveness or salvation by that task.
Is that the Harry Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life?
I don't know if that's where he got the name or not. Certainly the author of It's a Wonderful Life got his names from interesting places. Yeah, Bert and Ernie, or people got names from It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah, the other way around.
The other thing that you said is you have their Bailey mentions on line 499. These things were numbered,
Yeah,
and for memorization purposes, with the E, I mean, it wasn't like, I think when you think of poetry, you think of couplets, roses are red, violets are blue.
Easy
sugar
stuff.
is sweet and sour here, but it isn't that.
Yeah.
They were numbered and they were very easy. You can remember a section and a number and apply that to. The top of the page.
yeah, and you'd have to have it numbered in order to make reference to it.
Correct.
You know, just like the note I have here.
So these were really important works during their.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now you know everything you wanted to know and more about Dante and Chaucer. They wrote other things too, but those are just the most famous things they wrote. All right, next week we are going to look at how art changed as we're getting into this period of the Middle Ages. Some of the things that occur in art and also architecture. The way you build church buildings, cathedrals, it's going to change.
Where was Chaucer in relation to Henry VIII?
About 200 years before.
Before, because it was still Catholic, and after Henry VIII, it was.
Yeah.
Church of England.
Yeah, during his reign.
Right.
Yeah. So really, Chaucer is living about the same time as John Wycliffe, although we're not going to cover him until later. Who, in case you don't know, Wycliffe is the first one to translate the Bible into English. So he's part of this whole movement of putting things in the vernacular of the people so that they could read themselves. Okay. Well, see, we're not meeting next Sunday, but the Sunday following, we'll look at art, plays, buildings, things like that. Okay. All right, don't forget to tune into yctv.org and watch Discovering His Story. You tune into what's on there live this week. I think it's either finishing up Egypt or going into the Promised Land. And then we can always go to scroll down to Discovering His Story and go to the archives and watch from the very beginning. You might find the early episodes something to put yourself to sleep. You might find something interesting, more interesting as it goes on. All right, thanks for coming.
Some places.